joining the third webinar of 2014 entitled Preservation Financing, Funding Preservation Projects. And we encourage you to become a member and enjoy the educational benefits and discounts. Information on membership can be found on our website at californiapreservation.org. The California Preservation Foundation is a membership-based, not-for-profit organization whose mission is to ensure the protection of historic resources in California. The format for today's webinar will consist of 3 presentations by our esteemed speakers. Each session will be followed by time for audience participation and response. We will close with a roundtable discussion of a financing case study, we will close with a Q&A portion of 15 minutes. You may be polled for your opinion at appropriate times in the presentations. The poll box will briefly take up a large portion of your screen, but it will disappear when the poll is complete. There is a Q&A box on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, please type it in the box, and we will hold the question until it can be addressed by a speaker. There is also a chat box, which is visible to all participants. If you would like to comment or interject, you may do so through the chat box. If you are attached to a microphone, you should grant Adobe Connect voice access to your microphone when asked to do so. Your voice will be muted during most of the presentation, but you may raise your hand. At the top center portion of your screen is a small icon that looks like a person raising his hand. By clicking on the hand symbol, you will allow us to know that you're interested in asking a question. And at that time, we will allow you at an appropriate time to have a short dialogue with the speakers or ask your question in person. If for some reason your sound does not work, if you're not dialed into the conference line or your microphone isn't functioning, you will need to type in your question or response in the chat box. Today's presentation will be by Katie Lamont, Adam Ingles-Gershon, and Christine Fedukowski. Katie Lamont joined TNDC in April 2012 as Director of Housing Development. She is responsible for leading the housing development team as it carries out all phases of development, from feasibility through acquisition, pre-development, construction, and completion. Prior to joining TNDC, Katie worked 9 years for Eden Housing, most recently as Associate Director of Real Estate Development, where she supervised junior staff, led new business development activity, worked on policy, and managed her own project teams implementing all aspects of affordable housing development, including mixed use and mixed tenure developments and joint ventures with home builders and service providers. Prior to joining Eden in 2003, Katie was a project manager at the Los Angeles Community Design Center, now Adobe Communities. She began her career working in fair housing at Housing Opportunities Project for Excellence in Miami, and she earned her master's in urban planning from the University of California, Los Angeles, and a BA in American Civilization from Brown University. Adam Ingles-Gershon is president of the Capitera Group, a San Francisco commercial real estate investment and advisory firm. He is a development advisor, real estate lawyer, and commercial broker with particular expertise in leasing, including complex ground leases, historic buildings, and the disposition of public agency real estate assets. Mr. Ingles-Gershon was formerly Director of Real Estate for the Presidio Trust, where he led the trust efforts to generate revenue from the Presidio's 6 million square feet of buildings. He and his team handled the redevelopment, historic rehabilitation, leasing, and management of the Presidio's commercial and residential portfolio, which includes more than 1,100 residential units, as well as office buildings, warehouses, and other structures ranging from barracks to churches. Today, the Presidio Trust is financially self-sufficient and receives no federal appropriations. Christine Fedukowski founded CFC in 2010 and serves as its principal. CFC works with developers, investors, and cities involved in urban revitalization with the primary goal of redevelopment of historic buildings and neighborhoods. It takes an entrepreneurial approach to its investments using federal and state historic tax credits, new markets tax credits, state and local government incentives, conventional financing, and crowdfunding. Chris brings more than 25 years of experience in commercial real estate lending, structured finance, and urban economic development. Prior to forming CFC, she was one of the founders of NCTCIC, a for-profit subsidiary of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. a syndicator of historic and new markets tax credits. NTCIC has made more than $300 million in historic new markets tax credits investments in office, retail, residential, and performing arts projects. Chris has an MBA in real estate and urban economics and a BFA in music from the University of Connecticut, and an MA in arts management from American University in Washington, D.C. She is a former board member and a past president of the California Preservation Foundation. Katie Lamont will begin with a presentation of projects undertaken by the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation. Adam will follow by talking about preservation funding at the Presidio Trust. Chris will close by talking about preservation financing from an investor's perspective. Without further ado, we will now begin the presentation.
Okay, thank you all for joining us for this presentation. My name is Katie Lamont. I'm the Director of Housing Development with Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation. We are an nonprofit affordable housing company that was founded in 1981, originally to serve the Tenderloin district, and we have since expanded into some neighboring areas of the city of San Francisco. We provide affordable housing, and a large part of the housing that we provide is what we call supportive housing, housing that is coupled with services that enable folks to address some challenges that they may have in their lives. And the development that I'm going to be profiling today is called the Kelly Cullen Community, and it's a rehab of the historic YMCA building, and its current use is to serve 172 formerly homeless individuals, and it is on the ground floor space. There are actually 2 Department of Public Health clinics that serve the population that lives in the building, as well as folks in the broader neighborhood and throughout the city. There's also a retail storefront at the corner of the building, and that currently houses an art gallery. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the building itself, and then the way that we use the financing plan and the role that historic tax credits played in that, and some of the, in addition to the opportunity of the financing, it brought some of the challenges that came along with incorporating historic tax credits into the deal structure. So and I'm going to start out, I have a lot of pictures and there's some text later on, but a number of pictures that show the original state of the building or historic photos, and then how it looks after the historic rehab. So the building was built in 1909, is the second home of the Central YMCA. The architect was the McDougall brothers. At its height, it had 5,000 members and a 100-room hotel. And the YMCA, this building touched the lives of so many people in San Francisco. Like, as the development team was working on the rehab, so many people that we encountered on the rehab team or people that we talked to out in the field learned to swim at the Y, had taken judo classes at the Y. When I first came to visit San Francisco from LA, a friend of mine stayed at the Y. It really has an important place in the community and touched a lot of people. The original cost is kind of mind-blowing if you do development. It was $500,000, which translates to $12.5 million in today's dollars. But for us to actually complete the rehab that we did with the program we wanted to put into place, the total development cost was $90 million. And of that, $56 million was the construction costs. I'm going to scroll through some of the slides and talk a little bit more about the building. So there's basically was an open, the building actually kind of ended up having 3 different functions, and that there's a legacy of that today, and that the circulation in the building is still a little bit arcane. There was the public function of, there's this public space here. This is a grand lobby. There was an auditorium and fitness and gym areas. There were also offices, and there were classes that were offered. It was a second use of the building, and then the upper floors housed residential hotel units that largely served as tourist units. So I'm just going to show you some of these spaces. This is another view of that historic lobby. It's a 2-story atrium area. This is like the grand stairway from the entrance leading up to that space. And this is from that space looking down the stairs. I'll talk a little bit about just kind of the timeline. We purchased the building in June of 2007. The Y had decided that it was just not feasible for them to continue to own and upgrade this building. It was deemed at that time that it needed significant seismic improvements, and just the cost of that was not something that the Y could handle. So they actually entered into a purchase and sale agreement with a different developer called A.F. Evans, which is a for-profit entity that did both low-income and moderate-income housing. And there was financing secured from the city of San Francisco. And at the time, the city's Department of Public Health was just in the early stages of really pushing programs to provide housing to folks that use the public health system as a way to improve their health outcomes. And over time, the city's involvement in the project, the city's vision for what the project could be grew to such a point that it didn't fit the mission of A.F. Evans any longer. And they brought TNDC in to assist with the more supportive components of the project. And then A.F. Evans, for other reasons, ultimately went out of business, and so TNDC is the sole owner of the building. This next set of photos has a couple before and afters. Actually, I'm going to go back here. You can't see it so much, but in this little thing on the bottom right corner, this grand stairway was actually covered over at some point, and so as part of the historic renovation, you can see that in the bottom right photo that the flooring on the second floor was just built out to intercept that window. And as part of our restoration, we rebuilt this stair to match the original. And here's a picture of the new stair. And this is just a picture of, in the bottom right, the before condition when the stair was not there. Another view of that lobby. So that has an auditorium that has been restored. This is the before state, and this is the after state. And this is a space that is used by TNDC for some of our like all company meetings, and it's also available to the larger community. Folks are able to lease that for their own functions. I just want to check, is the sound okay? Someone put up a note saying sound is not okay. Okay.
Yes, the sound is perfectly fine on my end. I actually wanted to just make a quick comment and say for people that are having bad sound issues, it's possible that your connection is only able to handle so much of a bandwidth, but the recording should have a high quality sound, and we'll provide you with the recording at a later time.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this is the gym, which has been restored. This is the after condition. And so something I want you to see in this photo is if you look in the top left part, you see there's windows, but in the left part, those windows, there's a wall behind them, and that's related to the seismic strengthening that was necessary. We needed to install these seismic strengthening walls, and this actually triggered a lot of scrutiny from the National Park Service. So when we submitted our design plans to them, they really needed to understand why we were putting up a wall behind these windows. And once we were able to explain the reasoning and that we looked at other alternatives and this was the best alternative, they accepted that, but it did trigger for them that we had to do 6 supplements to our application describing the design through dealing with conditions that came up during the course of construction. And they definitely carefully reviewed all of our design changes after flagging that one as a big deal. This is just another before and after condition. So you just see there's just this beautiful tile work on the floors, this beautiful wood paneling throughout parts of the building. So now I'm in the text portion, and I'm just going to kind of summarize some things. And we kind of already discussed most of this, who we're serving, these historic event spaces. The pool in the ground floor has actually, it still remains. It needed to remain for the purpose of retaining the historic integrity of the building, but it's not currently used as such. It's actually covered over and is a meeting space. And then there's that gymnasium. So we have been working with the Department of Public Health and other local foundations to identify funding so that we can provide fitness programming in this beautiful space that's within the building. And we're endeavoring to do that, probably thinking about just the larger concept of health, where we have a clinic on the ground floor, but we want to think about all aspects of health, including physical fitness. This is just who the players were, the developers, ourselves, TNC Cahill is the contractor. Our main architect is Gelfand Partners, and then after we secured an LOI for an investment in the historic tax credits, we retained Frederick Knapp Architects. So they focused on the historic component in particular, and they worked with us to put together we actually did the Part 1 and Part 2 applications without them. I'll talk about what those terms mean in a moment. But they were really retained for the purpose of assuring the tax credit investor that the rehab that we did was going to pass all of the standards of the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior. And in addition to our retaining our own our historic architect, the investor retained an architect firm to themselves, like attend construction meetings, review the applications that went to the National Park Service, and just confirm for the investor's benefit that the rehab was going to be completed to the historic standards and that the tax credits would be delivered. So this was a very kind of long project in terms of the time it took to design it and get into construction. We bought it in 2007. We did exploratory demo in 2010, and it was about a 2-year construction period. This is just a summary of all the various sources that we had to assemble to pay for the work. And one thing you will notice is the second line here is ARA funding, American Reinvestment and Recovery Act funding. So the project was very challenged in that it was designed and permitted and ready to be built right when the financial markets collapsed a little over 5 years ago. And so we had secured two low-interest loans from the state that the state could not fund their obligations on because they were having bond credit issuing issues because of the state's budget crisis. And then we also had secured an allocation of low-income housing tax credits, a different kind of tax credit. But at that time in the market, there were no investors that were interested in financing a 172-unit historic rehab serving the formerly homeless. Though San Francisco is normally a very strong and attractive market for tax credit investors. So this, there was $20 million in early commitment from the city to support the project, and then these ARA funds came in to replace those 2 state funding programs and the tax credit funding that would have otherwise been secured through low-income housing tax credits. And then there's this piece, the PNC Bank piece, which is $16.2 million. The net amount of that is actually more like $13 million because some portion of it needs to be basically escrowed to buy back the property at the end. So it's a little over, I guess that's maybe about 15% of the total budget development sources. And then there's these other kind of smaller sources. I'm going to just talk a little bit about historic tax credits. To be eligible, a building has to be a National Historic Landmark listed in the National Register or contribute to a National Register Historic District or certain local districts. It must be income producing, which I have found to be significant when I have looked in the past at whether historic credits might be a good fit for a project. If you're planning to rehab a historic building into a community center that doesn't generate revenue, unfortunately, historic tax credits cannot be used for that purpose. And then using historic tax credits triggers that the project absolutely must be rehabbed according to the Secretary of Interior standards. And whereas normally in California, if you have a historic rehab, you go through your local planning department and then you have to go to the state office, the historic preservation officer. If you're using tax credits, you now have to go to those 2 entities, and then you also have to go to the national level. And something I have heard from my peers, and did not happen fortunately on this project, but happened in another project that our architect worked on, is sometimes something that SHPO agrees to, the National Park Service does not agree to, and then that has to be, I wouldn't say mediated, but I think what happens is the National Park Service wins. So that adds more time and process and more uncertainty. So this is a summary of the terms of our investment. I think the key thing to know really is that in our case anyway, the investment was tied to the application for the tax credits, which basically what you do is you apply to the Park Service. The first application is just to confirm that it's an eligible historic structure. The second is you have to prove that the historic standards are going to be met. And it involves careful documentation of the photos of the existing condition, a narrative description of the changes that were going to be made, plans illustrating the changes that were going to be made. And then at the end of the project, you submit the Part 3 approval, which is the National Park Service reviews that you did what you said you were going to do and you met the standards. And so there's some risk to the tax credit investor that the tax credit doesn't actually vest until the Part 3 approval comes. And while if you're doing everything properly, that should happen, there's no guarantee that it will happen. So that's just a risk that the investors need to mitigate. I'm going to describe some of the major challenges, and then I'll start to wrap up. So a major challenge with a building like this, particularly for an affordable housing developer who has lots of funds from lots of different entities that have lots of different public policy goals that they're trying to achieve, is balancing those goals. So major issues were, one, I mentioned earlier, the structural and seismic reinforcement of the building. Another thing is wanting to do features that are energy efficient. So a key area where this comes up is windows. We had to retain the existing windows, but sometimes we run into problems where existing windows are not very good windows, and we might want to replace them to be more energy efficient, and we're precluded from doing that because of historic. Another major issue is accessibility, especially in the city of San Francisco. They take accessibility of publicly funded projects very seriously. But that often requires changing things, widening doors or hallways, or changing the configuration of a unit, and that can it can be challenging to kind of balance all three of those goals and speak to the three different stakeholders about selling a solution that is really the best solution for the project, balancing all of those things. This is just a graphic that shows what I talked about earlier, that there's really three very historically different functions and still different functions of the building. So it's a little bit unusual for us as a housing developer to own a building that has a clinic component, so much public space, and then actually relatively little housing. This is the before condition for the units. This is after. These are just the pretty after photos. This is a cafe area. This is a laundry area. This is a rooftop garden. And then this is the health clinic. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Katie. I just wanted to do a quick check-in. I'm wondering if Chris is in the room right now.
Yes, I've heard the whole thing. I got back at 12.
Oh, perfect. Wonderful. So the next presentation will be covered by Adam, and we'll move over to his slide set right now. And Adam, you're ready when
Great.
Or we're ready when you are.
I'm all set. Thanks, John. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Adam Engelskirchen, and I was joking with Chris earlier that if you all can master my last name and her last name, the tax credit stuff will seem easy, I think. So my perspective is I worked for a number of years at a big law firm doing real estate transactions, then moved up to the Presidio Trust as a public agency attorney, and then switched over to the business side. And now I'm back in the private sector, working both as an attorney and as a development advisor and consultant. So I have both sort of the legal side and also the business side, and have been on the public and the private sectors. And what I really enjoy are the sort of high brain damage deals where it's tough to get projects done, requires a lot of thinking. And happily, the historic tax credit deals and the financing of historic rehabs satisfy that urge, sometimes more than I would like. And despite what my kids would tell you, listening to myself talk isn't actually my favorite thing. So please feel free to raise questions in the chat box if you care to. So I'm going to be talking a bit about historic buildings in the public sector, preservation strategies that are available to the public sector, and tools, and then I'll focus on some examples from the Presidio. So the first sort of takeaway, I think, is that there's a significant inventory of historic buildings in the public sector. GSA owns about 1,600 buildings, more than a quarter of which are listed or eligible for listing on the National Register, and another half of those are more than 50 years old. The Park Service has, this slide's not quite completed, has about 8,000 historic buildings that are not maintained by concessionaires. And the concessionaire in the Park Service is essentially a tenant, very similar to a tenant. And so they have a backlog of about $4.5 billion of deferred maintenance in those buildings. So there's clearly a need for creative leasing and financing tools to preserve these buildings. The military also has a significant inventory of historic buildings. They have been, over the years, a sort of unwitting preservationist in the sense that both as to historic buildings and open space. When we look around the Bay Area, we're often very grateful for the presence of the military because they prevented much of the real estate from being redeveloped, and that would have included the demolition of a lot of historic buildings. And then, of course, at the state, county, and local levels, there are also historic buildings, as well as educational institutions. Colleges tend to help a lot of historic buildings. So there are a number of strategies and tools that are available in the public sector. Some are optional, and some are forced requirements of federal law. So the National Historic Preservation Act applies to all projects that are receiving federal funding or permits. Section 106 is a consultation process that federal agencies are required to go through, and then Section 110 of the NHPA has a similar process. And I think that I'm not going to dive into these in too much detail, but the takeaway is that the obligations typically are not absolutely to preserve buildings, but more to go through a process that gives everyone an opportunity to comment and requires the agencies to evaluate the impact their decisions have on federal or on historic resources. So those processes are sometimes thought of simply as hoops one needs to jump through, but in my experience, they actually often result in substantive change because so many people get a chance to have input on the process. A couple of tools that I've had particular experience with are ground leases, and so a ground lease is in contrast to a normal space lease where someone might lease an office or a retail space for 5 or 10 years. A ground lease can often involve the leasing of just a piece of ground upon which someone builds a new building. But as I'm using it here, it's more a situation where someone leases the ground, but also a historic building that has not yet been rehabilitated. One of the nice things about ground leases is that for purposes of the preservation of the historic tax credit at the federal level, there's a requirement that the investment in the rehab of the building, the qualified rehabilitation expenditures, exceed the adjusted basis in the land. And so what that, adjusted basis in the building. And so what that typically means is that for someone who buys a piece of land with a building on it, a certain amount of the purchase price is allocated to the value of the building, and the person doing the tax credit project has to invest at least as much in rehabbing that building as the building cost. So that can be, in some projects, a real challenge. Where you've got a ground lease, you virtually always solve that issue because there's really no purchase price for the building. Ground leases offer public agencies a recurring revenue stream. We've all, I think, seen stories in the news or had experience with public agencies that get a big windfall and end up sort of spending it like a drunken sailor. So it's nice to have a recurring revenue stream sometimes. They can be structured very, very flexibly. The term has, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how long the lease lasts. If there's a capital contribution coming from the public agency, it can be built into the ground lease structure. And then there's a great deal more control that the public agency has if they want to limit the use of the building to certain purposes. They also benefit from the reversion at the end of the term. So the way it typically works is someone comes in and makes a significant investment in upgrading a property. They get to hold it for a significant term, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, and then it comes back to the public agency. Chris is going to talk quite a bit about historic tax credits, so I won't go into those in a lot of detail. except to say that in our experience at the Presidio, we've used them in connection with ground lease deals. They are more complicated when you have a ground lease involved, but it certainly is possible to do that. There are cases where there are earmarked transportation funds that have actually been used to rehabilitate historic train depots in the past. And then nonprofits can use the tax credits. So I'll be talking about that a bit more in one of the projects. So as John mentioned in the introduction, I was the director of real estate at the Presidio Trust for about 5 years. And just briefly, the Presidio was a military base under 3 flags, Spain, Mexico, and the United States. Its first building dates back to 1776. We have a bit of a running debate with the city of San Francisco as to whether we have the oldest building or the Mission Dolores in San Francisco is the oldest building in the city. When the Army left in the early 90s, there was a debate in Congress as to whether the Presidio would be sold off or preserved as a national park. Those who wanted it to be sold were concerned with what was then estimated at about a $50 million a year operating cost. They wanted to keep the taxpayers from having to pay that. And then, of course, there were those who wanted to preserve it as a park for reasons that ought to be fairly obvious. So the compromise was the Presidio Trust Act, which was an innovative piece of legislation that required it created the Presidio Trust, which is a federal agency overseen by a group of 7 directors appointed by the President of the United States. And the trust was required to make the Presidio financially self-sufficient by 2013. Fortunately, we had some decent real estate to work with. The Presidio has exclusive federal jurisdiction. So what that means is that it's not necessary to go through the entitlement process in San Francisco. We don't have to go to the Board of Supervisors. We don't have to go through San Francisco's building permit process. All of the entitlements are in-house at the Presidio Trust. So the trust is both the permitting agency and the landlord. And one of the really important features is that the National Historic Preservation Act review is handled in-house as well. So the people who are doing that are already familiar with the projects, and they're invested in seeing the projects succeed. So that's a huge help. And I'm talking in this case about projects that are not historic tax credit projects. The tax credit projects go, as Katie mentioned, they go to the State Historic Preservation Office for California, and then also to the National Park Service. So the first project is the Public Health Service Hospital. This is a building that was built in 1932 for hospital use. It was part of a district. The building in the foreground with it has a pipe coming out of the top was a steam plant. The whole district was on a unified heating system. It was the building was about 170,000 square feet. It has pretty sweeping views out to the left, looks out on the Pacific Ocean, and then it looks north to the bay as well, although much of that is covered by trees these days. This is the building soon after it opened. In the 1950s, these wings were added to the building, and I think most people did not think that was a good thing. When we went to put the building out for an offering, the trust intended that it would be used for residential use, and so it was offered out. We had a series of respondents, and there was a great debate about these wings. From a purely real estate perspective, the wings had a lot of value. They had good views. They added square footage, of course, which was important, but they were not popular with the neighbors who disliked them both for aesthetic reasons, but also for the size of the project and its impact on the neighbors. So what was eventually resolved was that the wings came down, and the big yellow machine you see in the foreground here was a tool that was used to essentially eat the wings. And they came down, and this was the result. And it was interesting. The demolition of the wings was, as I said, hotly disputed, but I think everyone who saw the project in its finished condition felt as though it was the right decision to take those down. So the project is 167 units. The construction cost is about $100 million. It features a 70-year ground lease. It involved historic tax credits. The developer was a company called Forest City, who did quite a good job. The project came up for its construction loan in 2008, right as the economy was going into such a tailspin, and it got one of the last construction loans out of Wachovia Bank before it was absorbed into Wells Fargo. I'll make a note here, too, about the duration of some of these projects. I finished writing the RFP at a cafe, an internet cafe in Baja on my honeymoon in 2003, and then I toured the project with my 6-year-old daughter in 2010. So sometimes these projects can take a long time. This is a project called the Bay School. The building was originally built in 1912. I believe it's about 60,000 square feet. And it was initially used as a school for cooks and bakers, and then later the Army converted it to barracks and offices. And it's one of the interesting things about this particular building is that when it was used as offices, it includes an office that was occupied by General DeWitt. General DeWitt was the one who signed the order interning the Japanese on the West Coast during World War II. And as he signed that order, less than a quarter mile away, Japanese Americans were working as code breakers in a building that the Presidio has since rehabilitated to honor their contributions. So that particular office was preserved and is available for people to tour by appointment. The building underwent a significant rehabilitation and now is operated as a private high school focusing on science and the environment, and it's been quite successful. The last project I'll profile is Building 100. It was built in 1909, originally as an Army band building, and it was rehabilitated by the International Center to End Violence, which is a group that works to protect women, children, and families from domestic violence. They have education programs, policy training, and political action, all designed to support that goal. One of the elements of their project was an addition. You can sort of see this is the back side of the building, I believe. No, sorry, that's the front. They added a fair amount of new construction to the back of the building, and that's one of the things that we've had challenges with over the years in the Presidio. There's a requirement that the new construction be clearly differentiated from the old, and so there's often a tension between a developer or a user who likes the idea of blending together the old and the new. And that's in contrast with the idea of making it clear what's old and what's new. And then there's this idea too that the new construction needs to be less visible, clearly sort of subservient to the historic building. And so one spends a lot of time on those issues. The building opened in 2008, and today the organization they host trainings where they bring in judges from around the world to educate them on domestic violence issues. The addition that I talked about was it's a very high-tech space where they can configure it in a bunch of different ways, and they have teleconferences and video conferences where people can join in from around the world. One of the things that was significant about this project is that the International Center to End Violence, they were formerly known as the Family Violence Prevention Fund, is a nonprofit, and they were someone who had, unlike Forest City in the Public Health Service Hospital project I showed at the beginning, the International Center to End Violence folks had zero real estate experience, and so what they did is they went out and hired a very able group of developers who worked on a fee basis to help them both structure the deal so that they could take advantage of the historic tax credits, but also to work their way through the lease negotiations, the hiring of a contractor, the approval of their plans, and ultimately the construction of the project. So there's a sort of hopeful note here for organizations that may not have the real estate expertise to do these projects. It is available out there if you bring in the right folks. So I'll leave you with just a few conclusions. As we noted at the beginning, public agencies have a lot of historic resources available to them. They are, I think, uniquely positioned to facilitate historic rehabilitation projects through public-private partnerships. You'll hear people complaining that public agencies are slow in their decision-making. They're subject to political forces. They're often constrained with a lack of funds. And of course, all those things can be true. But I think that given their role as stewards of these assets, there really is an opportunity for them to do innovative public-private partnerships that have the effect of preserving the historic resources. And then the last note I'll leave you with is that it's critical to have a clear understanding of the available tools. And I think Chris will talk about some of those issues, but it's important to have a sense as you go into a project what a realistic sense of the possibilities are. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I know we'll have a Q&A later on.
Thank you, Adam. I just wanted to also speak up and say that if you have any questions that come up during the course of any of these presentations, don't hesitate to type into the chat box or the Q&A box. You may also raise your hand and I'll make note of your name. And at the end of all three presentations, we will have the 15-minute Q&A period and everybody will be granted voice access. So with that being said, I'm going to open up the presentation to Chris Bezukowski, and I'm going to minimize the current PowerPoint presentation. And we're ready for you, Chris.
Okay, thank you very much, John. I thank CPS and John for putting all of this together, and I thank all of you for participating and giving us this opportunity to talk with you this morning. You know, whenever I think about tax credits, what always comes to mind to me is the opening of Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. You probably know what I'm talking about. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was a spring of hope. It was a winter of our despair. And indeed, that takes us to the tax credits. 20% tax credit, free money. Oh my gosh, this is the worst maze and jumble of IRS and NPS rules and regulations. You have investor requirements. You get one piece in place. Yay, we're in the spring of hope. Three pieces fall out. We're in the winter of despair. Adam, I'm sure you've gone through that any number of times. But indeed, the complexity should not deter anybody. The tools are all there, and it really is going to be very valuable for your project and I think for the preservation community as a whole. So what I want to do, what I was asked to do, was to talk about the tax credits from the investor perspective. I think as John said at the beginning, my background is as an investor. I was also in real estate development, commercial, or I should say conventional development before getting into the preservation arena in 1999. So I bring that perspective, and currently I'm working with both investors and developers in my own development projects. Before talking about the investor partnership, just a very quick overview of the historic tax credit, and this is the economic overview, not anything on the design side. First of all, and I apologize because I think Adam and Katie have already said this, but just to reiterate, the credit is equal to 20% of QREs. QRE, that refers to Qualified Rehabilitation Expenditure. What that means, and it's a little bit easier to think about what is not a QRE. The cost of acquisition is not a QRE. The cost of any new construction, if you were going to add a new floor to the building, or as in some of Adam's examples, he showed how there was a new construction that actually enlarged the building. Any costs associated with the so-called FF&E, furniture, fixtures, and equipment, would not be associated with that. Everything else, your hard costs, your soft costs, even some things you may not think about, your holding costs like property taxes, your cost of utilities, certain of your legal fees, certain of your financing costs, those are all QREs. The credit is taken, actually I should say it is earned, in the year the building is placed in service. Placed in service being the date that the building gets its certificate of occupancy. The credit is earned by the taxpayer or taxpayers that own the building, provided that the taxpayer has owned the building prior to its being placed in service. And I will also say here, if I can, provided that the building is depreciable. We can come back to that. Katie had mentioned that it has to be income producing, which is true, but I think if you think of it as a depreciable, because for instance, this could be important if a small business, or it could be a large business for that matter, if they own their building and they operate out of that building, that could be eligible for tax credits. They're not collecting rent on it. It isn't producing income, but it is depreciable. John, I just lost my PowerPoint on my screen.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And then quickly just on, it came back. And yes to the question that just came through. And then some quick things. The credit can be carried forward for 20 years, back for 1. The taxpayer must own the building for at least 5 years. Should the building be owned for less than 5 years, there is what is called a recapture event, where 20% of the tax credit amount would be recaptured for each year that is less than the 5-year period. So with that having said, let's think about the Historic Tax Credit Investor Partnership. And I guess the first question is why? Why do you do this? Why do you enter into a partnership? This is simply to, as it said, to monetize the credit. The two options are you can take the credit yourself, and that is if you have the ability to use the credit. One of the first things you have to think about is, do you have an income tax liability that is high enough that will let you use the credit? But then there are also a number of other rules and regulations that for the most part make it very difficult to use this credit unless you are what is called a widely held, or I should say publicly held and widely held corporation. So by creating these partnerships with those investors, such as banks, some of the energy companies, oil companies, utility companies, that do fall into that category where they have both the tax liability and they are also able to use it within the rules and regulations. That's the way you monetize the credit. You get cash for the credit. And then the next question is this the right source of financing from you? And so the first thing, just before you even go through the analysis, basically the way it works is your historic tax credit investor will contribute equity into your project, and in exchange they get their share of the tax credits. They also get profits, losses, and cash flow, as well as capital gains and losses that's generated by the project. First question for you and the investor, very mercenary, what is the project size? And I've noted 3 categories: projects less than $1 million, projects between $1 and $10 million, and then those projects that are $10 million and up. For any project less than $1 million, and specifically that's the QREs, so we're not looking at any acquisition or non-eligible expenditures, there really is, it's very difficult to get an investor for those credits. So probably you want to look and see if there is any way you can use the credit yourself. Between a $1 and $10 million range, it's a pretty wide range. But you could have modest investor interest, again, from 1 to 5. That would probably fall into some investors that have so-called small deal funds. But you might have there might be a pool of 2 to 4 investors to choose from. Once you get to the $10 million, that's when you're competitive and opened up to the full market. And then where would you find these investors? And again, if it's a very small deal, talk to your local accountant, attorneys, business colleagues, local banks. There might be the so-called country club set of investors. There are some very wealthy people out there that potentially could use it. As you get into that medium range, there are certain accounting firms that are very well known. Novogradac here in San Francisco is very well known. Cohn-Resnick. There are a number of Midwest firms and some on the East Coast that could help you. Same thing with attorneys, law firms, but again, they really do have to have that expertise in tax and real estate, specifically the historic tax credit. And the large deal, kind of the same thing. Then you're opened up to the larger money center banks. And you might ask, too, if you can talk to somebody at Forest City or other projects that you know who have done this. The one thing, then the question is, let's say you've made the decision, and let's just say for the heck of it, your project is $12 million. So the question is, how do you pitch the deal to the investor? What is the investor really going to look at? And the best thing I can say is what the investor is really looking at, it's the overall project feasibility. Really the same thing that you would look at. There's really no exclusions. It's any type of property, multifamily residential, commercial, office space, retail space, mixed use. It can be special purpose space, a performing arts hall, a school, a museum. They can be in urban areas. They can be in rural areas. The key is the project has to make sense. And again, as we said, it has to be depreciable. It cannot be a single-family residence, so that would preclude condominiums as well. And what I would say is your pitch, your 3-minute elevator speech, so to speak, what the investor wants to hear in that first conversation would be something like, I have a project that has $10 million in QREs. It's a $12 million total development cost, 50,000 square foot, 6-story building built in 1924 on the National Register with its NPS Part 2 approval. I have my financing commitments obtained. There's $1 million in developer equity, $1 million in a facade grant from the city. I have an $8 million construction loan commitment, and we are looking for $2 million in historic tax credit equity. Our construction start is late May 2014, 12-month construction period. About a 12-month stabilization in my ground floor retail space is 50% pre-leased. This is the second project that we have done with this development team. The key thing the investor is listening to is, what is the total number of QREs? When do you have your financing? And when are you going to complete construction? When they hear that, then they'll say, okay, we would like to look at your deal. And so that's when I think if the slide is up, I've noted 4 things. The first thing they're going to look at is the real estate project and you. What is your capacity? How does the development team, I see lots of questions coming in. We'll get to we'll get to that question, good question about what's going on with the tax credit. So they're going to look at what is the capacity of the development team, the architect and general contractor and even subcontractors, of course. Have they done historic tax credit projects before? Has this particular team worked together before? Also the operational management team. Who's the broker going to be? Who's the property management team going to be? If you have a residential property in an emerging district, warehouse district, you want to make sure that you've got some things in place, that this isn't going to be operated like a suburban team. I know everybody on this call knows that, but in the scheme of things, there's a big learning curve for a lot of the developers out there. Most of it, too, what they're going to look at is numbers, 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 your construction, your sources and uses. Very detailed line item statement. What are the numbers based on? Are they based on hard bids? Are the bids based on your final construction plans? The same thing with the operations. What is your pro forma? What are your revenues? What are your expenses? What are your operations? And then the feasibility, the market. What is the market? What are other similar properties operating at? What's going to make your property unique? What are the trends? Who is moving in? What are the demographics? And then for the good or the bad, the last thing they're going to look at or ask you about are your preservation goals. This slide, it just has some summary of the responsibilities, and I don't think there's anything new here. Pretty much you, the project developer, responsible for the project construction and management. On the tax credit syndication side, although when we get to the questions, Adam and Katie can chime in, you certainly will have to form the for-profit affiliates, but that's something you can work with. The other thing on the tax credit syndication side, you do have to think about guarantees. I have now in paren, those guarantees are limited, and I think I have 4 asterisks after it. You've probably all maybe heard of something called a revenue procedure that has recently come out, which has made some changes to the way these projects are being operated. So there will be guarantees, but kind of a good thing they're somewhat limited. On the tax credit investor side, they will underwrite your investment, like we had just talked about, and obtain their investment approvals. Again, and then they make the equity contribution in exchange for getting a membership interest. In other words, they will own a part of your project. They'll be allocated their share of tax credits. They will probably negotiate a preferred return, an annual return on their equity investment. And they will also participate in their share of profits, losses, and cash flow. CF is cash flow. And I left out one thing. We'll get it in there before this, before it's linked there. There will also be what's called a put option, and Katie had made reference to that. All of these terms and conditions will be spelled out in what's called either a term sheet or a letter of intent, and that will kind of be like the Bible, so to speak, and then Adam, people like Adam, the attorneys and the accountants will go through, and from that will generate all of the documents. Funding sources, again, just a summary. I do want to make sure we have enough time for questions and answers. I see a lot come in, so just skip that. Here is the transaction diagram. Again, I'd say keep this for reference, but you can see the project sponsor or developer is on the left-hand side, the upper left-hand side. They would make a contribution of their building into a so-called manager LLC, and then that manager LLC takes an ownership interest in the property owner. The tax credit investor is on the right-hand side, and you have typically a community development corporation, like a bank. That entity becomes a member of an LLC. That LLC becomes a member of that property owner. Moving on, this just expands and says who does what in each entity. I will say this is also what's referred to as a single entity, which frankly is rarely, if ever, used. Adam, I don't know if you've done any single entity deals recently. And this just expands it. It adds another layer. There is a subleasing entity on there. So those are just some visuals to give you an idea of what it looks like. So let's say you made the decision that, yes, I think this is good. We fit the parameters and we want to get started. So how do you get started? And I guess what I'm going to say is forget about the tax credit, forget about the transaction structures and the Internal Revenue Code, even forget about preservation. What you've got to do is set your goal by goal. It's the real estate kind of thing. Are you a building owner looking for tenants? In other words, is this a conventional retail deal? Are you a business or tenant looking for a building? Or are you city, either staff or official, or part of a nonprofit organization where you are looking to use the rehabilitation of a historic building as an economic revitalization tool? All of those, we've seen all of those strategies work, and the most important thing is to know which one you are so that you know how to build your team. The other thing is to understand what the tax credit or tax credit equity can and can't do. What it can do, it can take your project from being good and workable to being really solid and being really extraordinary. I say extraordinary not only in what you can put into it in terms of the architectural integrity, but also what you can do in terms of a community benefit, how strong of a presence it can have in the community, and if it's a straight profit-making deal, absolutely, it can boost your return. What it can't do, it can't make a project that is just languishing, that doesn't have a plan, that can't get financing. It can't take that project. It's not a silver bullet. It can't take that project from that point to a success. And the other thing, the last thing I'll say is understand what your other participants, other financing sources can and can't do, or maybe what I should say is, will the historic tax credit and your other financing sources play well together? And I think, gosh, Katie, I don't know how many financing sources you had there, and Adam, with everything that you listed, there's a bucket of tools that are out there, but they all have their special requirements. And I will say, at first blush, you're likely to find that they're not going to work well together. So then you just have to get everybody to sit down at the table and say, okay, where are the conflicts in the requirements and how can we work through them? Again, I think that if you have a good project in mind, you have a good team, then you can make it work. Once you've gotten started and you've set those goals and everything, the first thing that I would do is get your team together, both on the development side, your architect, your general contractor, thinking down the road for who your property management might be, but then on your finance team, and that certainly would be the accountants that have this experience in it and the person you will work with on the tax side. You might, as Adam mentioned, if you don't have that real estate expertise, you need to think about, do I have enough to engage somebody, to bring somebody on staff, or do you want to partner with somebody where they would do it on a fee basis, where they can help guide you through that? And once you have that team together and then you have that solid vision of what your project is going to do, I think you can be pretty assured that you will be able to take advantage of the tax credit. Lastly, this will be up just for reference, where there are sample source and use of funds on the left-hand side showing without preservation financing, the right-hand side showing with it. This slide shows very simply the tax credit and tax credit equity calculation. This takes it through to the operating pro forma, relatively small project, but you can see in the yellow I highlighted the difference, the advantages when you use the preservation financing. And then again, this is just another, it shows a little bit of the benefit and cost subsidy if you had a new construction or you did the financing without any tax credit, as compared to if you did a rehabilitation with the tax credit, and it shows some very positive things. It's very complex, and so I just have 3 pictures at the end. Why do we do all of this? And for me, it's because of this. These buildings, I think like we used to say at the trust, buildings aren't good because they're old because they're good. You just cannot replicate them. This was a warehouse, an old flour mill in Portland, Oregon that was rehabilitated for use as a tech campus. And this one you might recognize, you Californians. This is the REA building in the foreground. in Sacramento next to the train station that is being rehabbed now. And that's it.
Okay, thank you, Chris. And now we were going to open it up to a Q&A period. What I'm going to do is maximize our Q&A screen just so the speakers can see it, but none of the participants can see the questions. So I'm going to read them out. For the first question, I'm going to start asking, this question was assigned to Katie. The question was, the property I am working with requires significant structural work, which makes the project much less attractive from a developer perspective. And did the structural requirements of this project not have these issues, or if the project did, how was it resolved or addressed?
I don't think I have as comprehensive an answer as you would probably like, and I could get back to you with more details. I do know that the structural was really expensive at this particular site, and I know we explored a couple of different solutions, and one of the, I know you're asking particularly about cost, but I know another area that we really consider, particularly because these were small hotel units and kind of like SROs, is that we did not want to, we looked at solutions that would minimize the impact on the size of the existing space. So we used shotcrete to, like reinforce existing structures, and as something that would have minimal impact in like adding a whole new wall that would take up a bunch of space. That's the only kind of information I have readily available, so I could follow up with you more specifically at a later date. But I know this project was really, really expensive. And it could not have happened without all of the public support that we had. And I think it helped that the building really is an incredibly beautiful building that was really known and loved by many, many people.
Great, and I wanted to move to the next question. The next question I'm actually going to open up to everybody, and this is from Steve. Steve is asking, could you discuss finance program options that are available up front versus refunded or credited at the end?
Well, I will say now up front, I would say that certainly the historic tax credit, when you enter into a partnership, you will have a portion of that paid in at construction start. Typically, the way that works, the next installment is paid in at construction completion, which would be most of it. However, your investor will typically, or I should say often, also arrange to provide you with a bridge loan to bridge. So you have money in the form of a loan between construction start and completion. So in essence, the tax credit equity could be used to repay the bridge loan. But again, I just want to clarify that up front means, when you're starting construction, I don't know if you meant, if you were talking about a pre-development phase or acquisition phase, something before you have everything in place.
And I'll add from our experience at the Presidio, we've had kind of two models that might be relevant. One is where you have a nonprofit user. There's often a capital campaign early in the project to raise money to get the project off the ground and provide the equity that's required. And we usually have a tension between the nonprofit feeling the need to sort of tie up the building and feel they have a deal in place before they go out to their donors and say, this is the project that we're going to do. We want you to make your donations. That's on the one hand, and then there's the landlord or owner's perspective on the other hand, where they're reluctant to tie up a building with a tenant that doesn't yet have the money. And so we've done things like enter into option agreements or development agreements or things where there's a specific term and a timetable associated with the fundraising activity. So that's one option for nonprofits. And then another thing that we've seen happen sometimes is that sometimes there's an entity that has the desire to use a historic building. They have the ability to pay an ongoing rental stream, but they don't have the ability to come up with the initial capital to make the project work, to come up with that equity component. And in those cases, sometimes you can partner with a real estate developer who would be willing to invest that equity capital and take out the debt and go through the process of getting the project done, as long as they knew that at the back end they had a tenant who was willing and able to pay the rent to give them the kind of return that they'll need. So sometimes there's really an opportunity for a user who has the ability to pay rent to partner with the developer who has the ability to bring the equity capital.
And I would just say on that, and that's a very creative solution, if that tenant is a nonprofit organization, again, you do want to be careful of something called prior use and disqualified lease rules. None of us really touched on nonprofits, but I will say the tax credit most definitely can benefit nonprofit organizations, whether they're tenants or whether they're both a tenant and a owner, I'll say quote-unquote owner of the building. It is possible, and Adam certainly has gone through that. It is complex and the subject of an entire full day or week seminar, but I think it's important to know that it is possible.
Okay, and moving on to the next question. The question is, how many of these financial incentives or benefits or programs sort of require each project to comply with the Secretary of Interior standards?
All of the projects I do. Now, there is one exception, and we didn't talk about this, and I think it's an important. There is something called a 10% non-historic tax credit, which is available for a building that was built prior to 1936, provided that the structure is a building as they define it. In other words, there's enough of the existing structure remaining. The property must also be a non-residential property. It would not be available, say, if you're going to use a building for apartments. And also the building must not be on the National Register or eligible for the National Register.
Okay.
Most other financing that I know of, the tax credit, the Mills Act, facade easements, they do require compliance with the Secretary's standards.
Okay, and before I go on to the next question, I just wanted to mention to everybody that there will also be a portion of this Q&A period to ask from your phone if you're dialed in on the phone, and I will open up that access in due time. In order to ask a question with your own voice over the phone, you're going to need to press the raise hand button, which is on the top of your screen in the center. And if you raise your hand, I'll take people as they in the queue as they raise their hand, as long as they're on a phone. If not, you'll need to type in your question in the chat box. We just had a question come from Bill asking Katie what the projected expected income against costs for sustainability, or what were the projected expected income, what was the projected expected income against the cost for sustainability with the YMCA project?
So this project is, I was going to say unusual or different, I think, from it's distinct from the ones that were described for the Presidio and I think the ones that Christine talked about. And this is an example where in affordable housing, I don't know, we spend a lot of time structuring things. I don't know, there was a very complicated structure that was established to make it so that the tax credit, the entity that made the tax credit investment and received the benefits um, is an income generating entity, but the project as a whole is not really, like, especially given who it serves. Like an affordable housing project can have rents that exceed the operating costs and generate income and leverage debt. In theory, and a lot of projects do, but this particular project, given who it was designed to serve, it has extremely low rents and higher operating costs, and it's actually funded by, has an ongoing operating subsidy from the city. So that slide that Christine showed earlier with all, like the organizational structure with all of those different entities, that is something that we had to set up for our structure, and it is quite complicated. It's certainly the most complicated structure that we've ever had. So unfortunately, I don't really have a more refined explanation. It's something I could look into and discuss with you offline, or you would actually probably be better off talking to someone like Christine, who structures these investments all the time. Or maybe you could even answer that, Christine, looking at that chart of yours.
Yeah, well, I'd have to look at your projections. One thing I will say, just from a regulatory perspective, when you do the so-called quote-unquote twinning of the historic and the low-income historic tax credit, the requirements with respect to what's called a profit motive is different. And basically what it says is there is the expectation that expenses will exceed income. And that's when you do it in this case. Now, as Katie said, the way they structured this, I think that was both an abundance of caution with respect to the structure, but also there was an expectation on the part of the historic tax credit investor for some level of return. I don't know, was the question more to, maybe it was more broad than we are talking about? Just broadly, is this project going to be sustainable? And probably the answer to that is yes, I would think, Katie, correct?
Yes.
It will just come from your more traditional sources of grants and the federal, state, and local funding and such and so forth. Is that correct?
Yes. So the ongoing operations are supported both by the rental income from mostly from the residential, but there's also a retail space with the art gallery. And then there's the clinic has a fixed rent for its space, which covers its costs. Yeah. And then for the extremely low-income rents, there is an operating subsidy. But basically, yeah, the project will at least break even on the residential side, and we'll make a little bit of money on the clinic and retail side.
And I think as a public policy matter, with the tax credit, it seemed to me that what the tax credit enabled this project to do and what it enabled TNDC to do is really to provide an extraordinary space for people who have, have experienced tremendous hardship in their lives. And I think that's a wonderful public policy statement, and I think that benefits all of us. So I think in that respect, it's kind of a more qualitative benefit of the historic tax credit.
All right, and this next issue might incite a bit of discussion, but somebody, F. Whitman, asked, rumor has it that the historic tax credits, like new market tax credits, are on the chopping block. Any comments?
Well, yes, it's more than a rumor. The proposal came out from the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Representative David Camp, and the historic tax credit was one of quite a number of credits and deductions that were, it was proposed that it be repealed. In this particular proposal, the new market tax credit was not mentioned. However, as you know, the new market tax credit expires in 2013 and has not yet been renewed for 2014. So the thinking is they didn't have to propose it to be repealed because as of now it is expired. Having said that, and there are any number of very good articles out there on this in the opinion pages and economics pages and otherwise, and you can read them, it appears that this proposal is getting really no support in either the House or Senate from any side of the aisle. The proposal is meant to be kind of a conversation starter for tax credit reform. But it's been talked about, but it isn't there in black and white that the historic tax credit is to be repealed. So I think it's really important to be aware of this and to start strategizing for anybody who's here in the city. I think it's very important to have an education process to the city, and so they can make their proposals on up to our state and federal representatives and senators, and really continue to watch these tax reform discussions.
Okay, excellent. And I think we have one more question. And in the meantime, if anybody else has any further questions, please either raise your hand or type in the chat box. The question again comes from Bill. He's asking Katie if she deals with urban solutions on 6th Street in San Francisco.
I believe TNC has had some interaction with Urban Solutions. They were not involved in the Kelly Cullen project. But I know they have come to my attention in an entirely different context, like we're looking to build a grocery store in the Tenderloin. They've been suggested in that regard.
Okay. And we still have one question that appears to be coming in, so I'll wait for that to come in a second here. Susan Clark is about to ask a question, it seems. And
John, it might be worth mentioning just briefly that there has been a significant amount of, turmoil in the historic tax credit market over the last, Christine, I'm going to guess a year or so, maybe a touch more. There's
like 2 years, I'd say.
2 years. There's a case called Historic Boardwalk that the IRS won that defeated essentially a tax credit structure and concluded that it was not a true partnership. And then more recently, at the beginning of this year, there's a revenue ruling that came from the IRS. And I don't know that we need to dive into the details, but it's worth people being aware that the market is it's certainly evolving, and people are stepping back a bit to scratch their heads and figure out just how to structure deals to ensure that they're safe from a tax perspective. Chris, I don't know if you want to add anything more.
I think that it's very important to recognize. I think there were a lot of good things that came out of this, and even good things potentially for nonprofit organizations. But I think at the heart of it globally, if you're thinking about the historic tax credit and partnering with an investor, recognize, acknowledge they're going to be a real equity investor in the deal. This is an entity that will have real ownership. They will need to have an expectation of being able to participate in your project upside, cash flow, as well as downside. But I think overall it was good. It definitely, I'd say, Adam, raised the bar, though, for the level of expertise that's required to put the deal together, and then to also manage it through the 5-year compliance period.
Mm-hmm.
But it most definitely, at least in this case, it was very, I think it's important to note there was no issue with the historic tax credit, at least on this side. And then, of course, a month later, we get this tax reform proposal that says, oh, we're proposing repealing the tax credit.
All right. I also
Thanks, Chris.
I forgot to make one other announcement is that the California Preservation Foundation, along with a number of partners statewide, is working on a tax credit proposal at the state level, historic rehabilitation tax credit. I think the maximum of qualified expenses for that would be 25%, and it's currently going through the legislature right now. So I just wanted to make that announcement. So if you're interested in supporting California preservation in this effort or would like to learn more, feel free to get in touch with me or anybody at CPF. And I wanted to actually, at this moment in time, thank everybody, both the attendees and all three of our speakers who did an amazing job. I really enjoyed each of them. If there are no further questions, which it doesn't appear there are, I'm going to move over to the evaluation page. This is a very important portion of the presentation. We ask attendees to please fill out the evaluation. This allows us to improve our programs, fix any issues that may have arisen during the presentation, let us know how we're doing. I've also included a number of related links at the top of the page if you're interested in learning more. Please, when you fill out this survey, which everybody should see on the page right now, on the multiple choice question, the submit button is at the top of the page, and unfortunately I can't get it to go at the bottom. So I apologize for that, but when you fill out the entire survey, fill out each of these questions, and then scroll back up to the top of the page to submit your response. And then on the right-hand side of the page are two boxes. These are the boxes where you would provide more detailed information as to what sort of suggestions you have, what sort of topics you'd like taken up in future webinars. Thank you all for your time. And it looks like the survey is preparing, which I'll have it up in 1 minute here. But I just wanted to close by thanking everybody.
I messed that up.
That's okay. I'll fix it in a second here. So everybody, if you don't mind, please wait 1 minute for this survey to pop back up again. We would appreciate any of the feedback, and I will also send an email after this presentation with the final PowerPoint presentations, any handouts, a link to the recorded webinar with the password to access the webinar. So please use the password in order to access the recording. And we hope that you'll also register for the next webinar, which is on March 18th, also a Tuesday. And this webinar will be on cultural landscapes. We'll have 3 individuals from the National Park Service talking about Fort Mason, as far as I understand. So please attend that webinar if you can, and we thank you for your support. We also thank all 3 of our speakers, and I'm going to close the session at this moment. It's 1:29. Our timing is almost impeccable. But thanks again, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.